The restaurant was too elegant for what was about to happen. Clara Bennett watched her husband's mouth move, forming words that would shatter 8 years of marriage. "I'm in love with someone else." Around them, crystal clinked against china. Soft laughter drifted from nearby tables. The world hadn't stopped, only hers had. But instead of tears, something colder settled in her chest. Because she'd seen the hesitation in his eyes, the rehearsed cadence of his confession. This wasn't spontaneous heartbreak. This was theater, and Clara Bennett had always hated bad performances. If you want to see how this unfolds, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Okay. The reservation had been his idea. Clara should have known something was wrong when Adrian suggested Aurelius on a random Tuesday. Not their anniversary, not her birthday. Just a Tuesday in October when London rain turned the streets into mirrors and the city smelled like wet stone and exhaust. She'd been working late at the firm, finalizing renderings for the Kensington project, a boutique hotel conversion that would either make her career or confirm every doubt her senior partners had about promoting a woman to lead architect. Her phone had buzzed while she was adjusting the skylight angles for the third time. "Dinner tonight? 8 p.m., Aurelius. Wear something nice. Not would you like to or are you free? Just a statement, an expectation." Clara had stared him the message, her stylus hovering over the digital blueprint. In 8 years of marriage, Adrian had suggested Aurelius exactly twice. Once when he'd gotten promoted to senior analyst at Whitmore Financial. Once when they'd celebrated their 5th anniversary, back when they still celebrated things. She should have said no. Should have told him she had work, which was true. Should have recognized the warning signs. But she'd been tired of eating takeaway alone in their Notting Hill townhouse while Adrian worked late. Tired of the distance that had grown between them like frost on glass, slow, inevitable, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. So she'd gone home. Changed into the midnight blue dress he'd bought her last Christmas. Applied makeup with hands that knew the routine so well they didn't need her full attention. Looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger, 32 years old, successful, married, and somehow completely alone. The restaurant suited Adrian's aesthetic perfectly. All dark wood and low lighting, the kind of place where every surface gleamed and the prices weren't printed on the menu. Where investment bankers brought clients to impress them and husbands brought wives to break their hearts. He'd already been seated when she arrived. Charcoal suit, no tie, his dark hair styled with that effortless precision that actually required significant effort. Handsome in the way that photographs captured, but somehow never felt warm in person. "You look beautiful," he'd said, standing as she approached. The comment felt like an accusation. "You look nervous," she'd replied. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe. Adrian didn't like being read. He'd built a career on controlling narratives, on presenting information exactly how he wanted it received. Market reports, financial projections, carefully structured lies. "Do I?" He'd smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I'm just out of practice. Feels like we haven't done this in ages." They'd ordered. She couldn't remember what. Something expensive that would taste like sawdust in her mouth. The waiter had poured wine, red for him, white for her, and disappeared into the ambient murmur of other people's conversations. Adrian had waited until after the appetizers arrived. Some delicate arrangement of scallops and microgreens that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. "We need to talk," he'd said. 5 words. 30 years of romantic comedies and relationship advice columns had taught the world that these 5 words meant nothing good. But Clara had expected conflict about money, maybe. Or his mother, who'd never approved of her. Or the fact that they hadn't had sex in 3 months, and neither of them had seemed to notice. She hadn't expected what came next. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About our marriage. About what I want from life." He'd paused, taking a sip of wine, buying time. "Clara, I'm in love with someone else." The restaurant hadn't stopped. A woman 2 tables over laughed at something her companion said. A waiter glided past with a tray of pristine desserts. Somewhere, a phone buzzed discreetly. Clara had set down her fork with careful precision. "How long?" "Does it matter?" "Yes." He'd sighed like she was being difficult, like she was the one making this harder than it needed to be. 6 months. Maybe 7. 7 months. She'd repeated it slowly, tasting each word. So around March, when you went to that conference in Edinburgh, Clara, or was it earlier? The client dinner in February you came home late from, smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. His jaw had tightened. I didn't come here to be interrogated. No? She'd leaned back in her chair, studying him like she would a problematic blueprint, looking for the structural weaknesses. Then why did you come here? To what exactly? Soften the blow with expensive scallops? I came here because I owe you honesty. Because after 8 years, you deserve to hear this from me, not find out some other way. The laugh that escaped her surprised them both. Sharp, bitter. Nothing like the polite sounds she usually made at firm dinners and charity functions. Honesty? Right, because the honest thing is definitely to fuck someone else for half a year and then announce it over dinner. A woman at the next table had glanced over. Adrian's expression had tightened further. Keep your voice down. Or what? You'll be embarrassed? Clara had leaned forward. Tell me something. Is she younger than me? That's not... Is she? Yes. How much younger? Clara, this isn't about... How? Much. 26. Of course. Of course she was 26, young enough to be impressed by his job title and his carefully curated Instagram presence, young enough not to notice the way he controlled every conversation, every decision, every aspect of his life with exhausting precision. Young enough not to be tired yet. What's her name? Clara had asked. I don't think... Her name, Adrian, since we're being honest. Sophie. Sophie. Clara had picked up her wine glass, watching the light refract through pale gold liquid. Does Sophie know you're married? Yes. And she's fine with it? She understands that these things are complicated, that marriage isn't always, that sometimes people grow apart. How enlightened of her. Clara had taken a long drink. So what now? You want a divorce? He'd nodded, finally. The real reason for this dinner. Not confession, transaction. I've already spoken to a lawyer. We can keep this civil. Divide assets fairly. You keep the house, I'll keep my investment portfolio. We both walk away clean. Clean. As if 8 years of marriage could be divided like stocks and bonds. As if she was just another asset to be liquidated and moved off the books. You've already spoken to a lawyer, she'd repeated. I wanted to have a plan. I thought it would make this easier. For who? He'd had the grace to look uncomfortable, briefly. For both of us. Clara had set down her wine glass and reached for her purse. For one moment, Adrian's face had shifted. Relief, maybe. Thinking she was leaving. Thinking this conversation was over and he'd executed his plan successfully. Instead, she'd pulled out her phone. What are you doing? He'd asked. She'd opened her banking app, the joint savings account they'd both contributed to for 8 years. The account that was supposed to fund their future. A bigger house, maybe children someday, retirement in some picturesque place where the weather was better and life was simpler. The account that, according to her screen, had £47,000 less than it should have. Clara, where's the money, Adrian? His face had gone carefully blank. The expression he used in meetings when someone asked a question he didn't want to answer. I don't know what you mean. £47,000, gone. Withdrawn over the past 6 months in increments small enough that I wouldn't notice immediately. She'd looked up from her phone, meeting his eyes. Where is it? That's my money too. Our money. I had a right. A right to what? Steal from our joint account to finance your affair? I didn't steal anything. I took what was mine to take care of some investments. Investments. Claire had felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. What kind of investments? He'd said nothing. The hotel stays? The jewelry I'm guessing you didn't buy for me? Maybe a nice flat for Sophie, somewhere convenient when you're working late? You're being dramatic. I'm being dramatic. She'd laughed again, louder this time. Heads had definitely turned now. You embezzle almost £50,000, fuck a 26-year-old for half a year, and announce you want a divorce over 70-pound scallops, and I'm being dramatic. Lower your voice. No. Adrian's expression had shifted then, the mask slipping. Beneath the careful composure, she'd seen something ugly. Resentment. Anger. The face of a man who'd planned this entire evening down to the last detail and was watching it spiral out of his control. "I tried to do this nicely," he'd said, his voice low and tight. "I could have just left, could have cleaned out the account and disappeared. But I came here. I told you the truth. I'm trying to do the right thing. The right thing would have been not fucking Sophie. Christ, Clara, do you want to know the truth? The real truth?" He'd leaned forward, and for the first time all evening, she'd seen genuine emotion on his face. "I've been unhappy for years. Years. You're married to your work, to that fucking firm that doesn't appreciate you, to a career that's going nowhere while I've been building something real. We haven't had a real conversation in months. We barely even look at each other anymore. So yes, I met someone who actually sees me, who's excited to be with me, who doesn't treat me like an obligation." The words had landed like punches, each one carefully aimed at old wounds. "So this is my fault," Clara had said quietly. "I didn't say that. You just implied it. I'm saying we both let this marriage die. I'm just the one with the courage to admit it." Courage. He'd called it courage. Claire had stood then, gathering her purse, her phone, her coat. The entire restaurant was watching now. She didn't care. "You're right about one thing," she'd said, looking down at him. "We should have had this conversation a long time ago. But not here, not like this. You don't get to control the narrative anymore, Adrian. You don't get to frame this as mutual dissolution or natural growing apart. You stole from me. You lied to me. You betrayed me in every way that matters. And you did it while pretending to be the civilized one. Where are you going? Home. To the house you so generously offered to let me keep in your pre-planned divorce settlement. How kind of you." She'd started to walk away when his voice had stopped her. "This doesn't have to get ugly, Clara." She'd turned back, looked at her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, sitting there in his expensive suit at his expensive table, thinking he still had any control over how this ended. "Yes," she'd said, "it really does." The rain had gotten heavier by the time Clara reached the street. She'd stood under the restaurant's awning, watching water cascade over the edge, feeling nothing and everything at once. Her phone had buzzed. "Adrian, let's talk when you've calmed down. We can work this out like adults." Like adults. As if she was the one being unreasonable. She'd deleted the message and opened a new search. Divorce Attorneys London. The ride home had been a blur of rain-slicked streets and red brake lights. The driver had tried to make small talk, but Clara had pretended not to hear him. Her mind was spinning, cataloging details she'd been too blind or too tired to see. The late nights that had stretched from occasional to routine, the password he'd added to his phone 6 months ago, the new cologne, the gym membership he'd actually started using, the way he'd stopped asking about her day, stopped pretending to care about her projects, stopped touching her except when circumstances demanded it. How long had she been living with a stranger? How long had she pretended not to notice? The house was dark when she arrived. Their house. The Notting Hill townhouse they'd bought 5 years ago, back when they still used words like our and we and future. 3 stories of carefully renovated Victorian architecture that Clara had spent months perfecting. High ceilings, original moldings, a skylight in the master bedroom that turned sunrise into art. She'd loved this house once. Now it felt like a mausoleum for a marriage that had died without her noticing. Clara had dropped her coat on the hall chair, kicked off her heels, and gone straight to Adrian's study. The door was never locked. He was too confident in his own cleverness for basic security. His laptop sat on the desk, closed but not password protected when sleeping. Another oversight. Adrian believed in his own invincibility, in his ability to manage and control every variable. He'd forgotten that Clara was an architect, that her job was literally to look at structures and find the weaknesses, to see what wasn't working and rebuild it better. She'd opened the laptop and started searching. Bank statements. Deleted emails that weren't actually deleted, just moved to a folder labeled Archive. Credit card receipts for restaurants she'd never been to, hotels she'd never stayed in, jewelry she'd never received. Sophie Laurent, 26, junior marketing associate at a tech startup in Shoreditch. Instagram filled with carefully curated photos of brunch and yoga and motivational quotes about living your best life. And photos of Adrian. Not many, just enough to confirm what Clara already knew. The hotel stays had started in March. The Savoy, the Langham, the Corinthia. Not cheap, not discreet. Adrian had used their joint credit card for 2 of them before switching to his personal account. Arrogant, sloppy, convinced she'd never look. Clara had photographed everything. Every receipt, every statement, every email. Her phone's camera roll had filled with evidence of betrayal, meticulously documented. She'd found the apartment rental agreement in a folder marked Personal Investments. A 1-bedroom flat in Canary Wharf. £1,700 a month, paid from their joint savings account, withdrawn in cash to avoid detection. Except Clara had detected it. Finally. The clock on Adrian's desk had read 11:47 when she'd finally stopped searching. Her back ached from hunching over the laptop. Her eyes burned. But her mind was crystal clear. This wasn't just infidelity. This was financial abuse, theft, a systematic dismantling of their shared life while he pretended everything was fine, while he made her feel crazy for noticing the distance, while he planned his exit and controlled every detail. Her phone had buzzed again. Another message from Adrian. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. We can talk tomorrow when you're ready to be reasonable. Reasonable. She'd almost laughed. Instead, she'd opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in 3 years. Miranda Ashworth. They'd met at a charity auction, bonded over terrible wine and worse conversation from the other attendees. Miranda had been recently divorced, sharp-tongued and sharper-minded, and she'd given Clara her card with a wry smile. If you ever need a divorce attorney who fights dirty, call me, though I hope you never do. Clara had kept the card. She'd pulled it from her wallet now, the edges slightly bent, but the number still legible. It was almost midnight, too late for professional calls, but something told her Miranda Ashworth didn't keep conventional hours. The phone had rung 3 times before a familiar voice answered. This is Miranda? Miranda Ashworth? Yes. Who's this? Clara Bennett. We met a few years ago at the childhood literacy auction. You're the architect. I remember. A pause. It's nearly midnight, Clara. This must be important. My husband wants a divorce. I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be. I want your help destroying him. The pause that followed felt loaded. Then Miranda had laughed, a sound like broken glass and bourbon. Well, I'm listening. Clara had told her everything, the affair, the money, the calculated cruelty of the restaurant confession, the evidence she'd spent the evening collecting. She'd laid it out with the same precision she used for architectural plans, every detail in its place, every connection clear. When she'd finished, Miranda had been quiet for a moment. You said he's already contacted a lawyer. He mentioned it at dinner, wanted to keep things civil. Civil means he wants to control the narrative, keep you quiet, make you grateful he's being fair while he walks away with his reputation intact and his girlfriend on his arm. Another pause. How much did he take from your joint account? £47,000, maybe more if I look further back. And you have documentation? Photos of everything, bank statements, emails, hotel receipts, the rental agreement for the flat he's keeping for her. Clara Bennett. Miranda's voice had warmed with something close to approval. I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to be honest. How ugly are you willing to let this get? Clara had looked around Adrian's study. At the mahogany desk he'd insisted on buying. At the first edition books he'd never read, purchased because they looked impressive. At the wedding photo on the shelf, both of them smiling, younger, stupid with hope. As ugly as it needs to be, she'd said. Good. Don't delete anything. Don't confront him again. Don't let him know you're building a case. Can you do that? Yes. My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring everything. The call had ended. Clara had sat in the silence of her husband's study, surrounded by evidence of his deception, and felt something shift inside her. Not heartbreak. Not anymore. Strategy. She'd spent 8 years being the understanding wife, the supportive partner, the woman who didn't make demands, didn't ask too many questions, didn't rock the boat. That woman was done. Adrian had wanted honesty. He was about to learn what honesty really cost. Clara had spent the rest of the night organizing files, backing up evidence, building her case with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her architecture work. Every email, every receipt, every transaction. She'd created a timeline, cross-referenced dates, found patterns in his spending. The affair hadn't started in March. It had started in January, maybe earlier. The money hadn't just gone to hotel rooms and jewelry. There were cash withdrawals, large ones, patterns that suggested regular payments for something or someone. By the time dawn broke over London, Clara had assembled a file that would make Miranda Ashworth smile and Adrian Cole panic. She'd showered, dressed in her sharpest suit, and headed to the office early. Her senior partners had been surprised to see her there before 8, but Clara had smiled and explained she was just catching up on the Kensington project. She'd worked until 8:47, then gathered her things and left for Miranda's office in Mayfair. The building was exactly what she'd expected: old money architecture with modern interior design, expensive without being ostentatious, power that didn't need to announce itself. Miranda had been waiting in her office, 50-something, elegant in the way that came from confidence rather than effort. Silver hair cut sharp as a knife, eyes that missed nothing. "Clara." She'd stood, extending a hand. "You look surprisingly well for someone whose marriage imploded yesterday." "I didn't sleep much." "I can tell. Coffee?" "Please." They'd sat across from each other while Clara had spread out her evidence. Bank statements, emails, photos, the rental agreement, the timeline she'd constructed. Miranda had reviewed it all in silence, her expression giving nothing away. When she'd finally looked up, there was something almost predatory in her smile. "Your husband is an idiot. I'm starting to realize that. He stole from your joint account to fund an affair and keep a separate apartment for his mistress. He used joint credit cards for hotel rooms. He kept emails. He documented his own crime spree." Miranda had tapped the rental agreement. "This alone is enough to bury him in court." "What about the affair? Does that matter legally?" "The UK has no-fault divorce, so technically the adultery itself won't affect the settlement. But the financial misconduct, the misuse of joint assets, that matters. That matters a lot." She'd leaned back in her chair. "How much do you want?" "Everything I'm entitled to, everything he took, and I want him to know he doesn't control this anymore." "Vindictive or justice?" "Both." Miranda had smiled again. "I like you, Clara. You're going to be an excellent client. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to file first. Not him, us. We're going to request a full financial disclosure. We're going to document every penny he took and spent on that girl. We're going to make him wish he'd just walked away quietly instead of trying to manage you." He said he wanted to keep it civil. Civil is what men say when they want women to stay quiet about being wronged. We're not going to be civil. We're going to be correct, legal, devastating. She'd pushed a contract across the desk. "My retainer is £10,000, worth every penny. What do you say?" Clara had pulled out her checkbook. "When do we start?" "We already have." The next week had been a blur of legal paperwork and strategic silence. Adrian had called repeatedly. She'd ignored every call. He'd texted. She'd archived every message without responding. He'd shown up at the house once, but she'd had the locks changed and simply watched from an upstairs window as he'd rattled the door handle and finally left. Miranda's team had worked with surgical precision. Filing first had been a calculated move. Adrian's lawyer, some corporate stooge named Phillips, had been caught flat-footed when he'd received the petition. Bennett versus Cole. Petitioner seeks divorce on grounds of irretrievable breakdown. Petitioner additionally seeks full accounting of joint assets and restitution for misappropriated funds. Phillips had called Miranda immediately. She'd let it go to voicemail. Adrian had shown up at Clara's office 3 days after the filing. She'd been in a meeting with her senior partners when her assistant had buzzed through. "Mrs. Bennett, your husband is here. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's quite insistent." Clara had excused herself and found Adrian in the reception area. He'd looked rough, unshaven, his shirt wrinkled. Not the polished man who'd destroyed her over scallops. "We need to talk," he'd said. "No." "Clara, this is ridiculous. You filed for divorce? I was trying to do this the easy way." "The easy way for you. What do you want? Money? Fine. I'll give you more than half the house value, but you need to drop this investigation into our finances. It's embarrassing. For you. For both of us. Do you want everyone knowing our business?" Clara had looked at him, really looked, at the man she'd married 8 years ago, the man she'd trusted with her future, her finances, her heart. "I want everyone knowing what you did," she'd said quietly. "I want Sophie knowing. I want your colleagues knowing. I want Phillips explaining to a judge why you stole £50,000 to fund an affair. That's what I want." His expression had darkened. "You're making a mistake." "No, I made a mistake 8 years ago. This is me fixing it. I can make this very difficult for you, Clara. I have resources, connections. You think your little firm will be happy when I start making calls? When clients hear about the unstable architect with the messy divorce?" Security had arrived then. Clara had texted them while Adrian was monologuing. "Mr. Cole," the guard had said, "you need to leave." "This isn't over," Adrian had said to Clara. "Yes," she'd replied. "It really is." The deposition would come later. The discovery would destroy him. But Clara knew with absolute certainty that Adrian had lost the moment he'd chosen that restaurant, chosen honesty without accountability, chosen to believe he could control how this ended. He couldn't, and Clara Bennett was just getting started. The deposition was scheduled for 2 weeks after Adrian's failed attempt at intimidation, 14 days that felt simultaneously endless and too short. Clara spent them preparing, reviewing documents with Miranda's team, learning legal terminology that sounded like a foreign language. "Discovery is our nuclear option," Miranda had explained during one of their strategy sessions. "We're going to request every financial record, every email, every text message. He'll fight it. They always do. But the court will compel compliance, and when they do, we'll have everything." "What if he deletes things?" Miranda's smile had been sharp. "Then we add obstruction of justice to the list. Digital forensics can recover almost anything. The harder he tries to hide it, the worse he looks." Clara had nodded, trying to absorb the strategy. Her world had become a strange mix of architectural deadlines and legal warfare. She'd present hotel designs in the morning and review asset disclosures in the afternoon. Her colleagues had started to notice the strain. "You all right?" James, her project partner, had asked one afternoon. They'd been reviewing structural calculations for the Kensington building, but Clara had caught herself reading the same column of numbers 3 times without comprehension. "Fine," she'd lied. "You've said fine 14 times in the past 2 weeks. I'm starting to think you don't know what the word means." She'd looked up from the blueprints. James was younger than her by a few years, brilliant with sustainable design, terrible at reading social cues. Except apparently now. "Personal stuff," she'd said. "The husband?" "How did you eat? You stopped wearing your ring, and you've been here until 9 every night, which suggests you're avoiding going home. Plus, Margaret from accounting saw you meeting with Miranda Ashworth." He'd shrugged. "Margaret's sister works in Ashworth's building. Small world." "Christ." "Sorry, people talk." He'd paused, then added with surprising gentleness. "For what it's worth, I always thought he was a prick. Too smooth. The kind of guy who'd use synergy unironically." Despite everything, Clara had laughed. "He does love that word. You'll be better off. And the Kensington project is brilliant, by the way. Don't let personal shit make you doubt that." It was maybe the nicest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. The night before the deposition, Clara couldn't sleep. She'd lain in bed, their bed, though Adrian had never returned to claim his side, and stared at the skylight. Rain pattered against the glass, turning the darkness into abstract patterns. Her phone had buzzed at 2 a.m. Unknown number. "You don't know what you're doing. Drop this before you regret it." She'd stared at the message for a long moment, then forwarded it to Miranda with a note. "Add harassment to the list." Miranda's response had come through almost immediately. "Already screenshotted. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we make him bleed." The deposition took place in a conference room that smelled like expensive coffee and fear. Adrian sat across from Clara, his lawyer beside him. Phillips was exactly what she'd expected. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of practice neutrality that probably cost £500 an hour. Adrian looked worse than he had at her office. Thinner. The polish had worn off, revealing something desperate underneath. Miranda had started with simple questions: name, date of birth, occupation, building a record. Then she'd shifted gears. "Mr. Cole, are you currently in a romantic relationship with Sophie Laurent?" Phillips had leaned forward. "I don't see how that's relevant to..." "It's relevant to the financial misconduct we're documenting. Your client used marital assets to fund this relationship. I'm establishing the connection. Miranda hadn't looked at Phillips. Her focus stayed on Adrian. Mr. Cole? Yes, Adrian had said. How long have you been involved with Ms. Laurent? 6 months. Are you certain? Because we have evidence suggesting the relationship began in January, 9 months ago. Adrian's jaw had tightened. Fine. 9 months. Did you use funds from your joint marital account to facilitate this relationship? I used money that was partially mine. Did you use funds from the joint account, yes or no? Yes. How much? I don't know the exact. Miranda had slid a document across the table. We've calculated 47,322 pounds. Does that sound accurate? Adrian had glanced at Phillips, who'd nodded slightly. Approximately, Adrian had said. What did you use this money for? Various expenses, such as personal items, travel, entertainment. You rented an apartment in Canary Wharf, 1,700 pounds per month for 9 months. That's 15,300 pounds. Did that come from the joint account? Silence. Mr. Cole? Yes. And the hotel stays? The Savoy, the Langham, the Corinthia. We have receipts totaling 8,000 pounds. Joint account? Some of them. Some or all? Adrian's composure had started to crack. All of them. The jewelry purchases from Tiffany and Cartier. 12,000 pounds for Miss Laurent? I don't have to answer. Actually, you do. This is a deposition. You're under oath. Did you purchase jewelry for Miss Laurent using marital funds? Yes. Claire had watched this exchange like a spectator at a tennis match. Each question a serve, each answer a point scored. Miranda was methodical, ruthless, building a case brick by brick. Did you inform your wife about these expenditures? No. Did you have her permission to use joint funds for these purposes? We didn't need permission for every transaction. But you concealed these specific transactions, correct? You withdrew cash to avoid paper trails. You deleted emails. You created a separate folder on your computer labeled Archive, where you stored correspondence with Ms. Laurent. I'm entitled to privacy. Not when you're stealing from your wife to finance an affair. Phillips had objected, but the damage was done. Adrian's face had gone red, his hands clenched on the table. The deposition had continued for 3 hours. By the end, Miranda had extracted admissions about every hotel stay, every cash withdrawal, every lie. She'd gotten Adrian to admit he'd planned to file for divorce on his terms, with a settlement that would have given Clara the house but protected his financial assets. She'd made him acknowledge that he'd consulted a lawyer before ever telling Clara about the affair. When it was over, Adrian had looked like he'd been beaten, which Clara supposed he had been. In the hallway afterward, Phillips had pulled Miranda aside. Clara had watched them talk in low voices, Phillips gesturing, Miranda shaking her head firmly. They want to settle, Miranda had said when she'd returned. Phillips is spooked. He knows how bad this looks. What are they offering? 65% of marital assets to you, full restitution for the money he took, plus his agreement not to contest your petition. You keep the house, he keeps his investments, you split the rest. That's it? That's better than most divorces. He's trying to avoid a trial. A judge would crucify him for the financial misconduct, and he knows it. Clara had considered this. 65% was more than half. Restitution meant she'd get back what he'd stolen. The house was hers. She could walk away, start over, leave this nightmare behind, but something in her refused to let it be that easy. What would we get at trial? She'd asked. Miranda's expression had shifted. Potentially more. 70, maybe 75%. The judge would likely penalize him for the affair spending. But trials are expensive, emotionally and financially, and there's always risk. What kind of risk? That a judge goes easy on him, that some technicality gets evidence excluded, that 12 months from now we're still fighting and you're drained and broke and wondering why you didn't take the settlement. But you don't think that'll happen? I think you have the strongest case I've seen in 5 years. I think Adrian Cole is a thief who got caught and is now panicking. I think we could destroy him. Miranda had paused. But I also think you need to decide what you actually want. revenge or resolution. Clara had looked through the conference room window at Adrian. He'd been on his phone, probably calling Sophie, probably complaining about his bitch of an ex-wife who wouldn't just take the money and disappear quietly. I want him to understand he can't do this to people, Clara had said. I want consequences. Real ones. Miranda had smiled. Then we go to trial. The response to Phillips had been delivered the next day. Clara had almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The settlement rejection had triggered the next phase, full discovery. Miranda's team had filed motions requesting 5 years of financial records, all email accounts, phone records, credit card statements, everything. Adrian had fought it. Of course he had. Phillips had filed objections, claiming the requests were overly broad, invasive, irrelevant. The judge had disagreed. The petitioner has demonstrated clear evidence of financial misconduct, Judge Brennan had ruled during a preliminary hearing. The respondent's use of marital assets to facilitate an extramarital affair is directly relevant to the equitable distribution of property. Motion for discovery is granted. Mr. Cole has 30 days to comply. Adrian's face during that hearing had been something Clara would remember forever. The realization that he couldn't control this, couldn't manage it, couldn't make it go away with charm or money or carefully worded explanations. The discovery process had been revelatory. The forensic accountant Miranda had hired, a cheerful woman named Diane who looked like someone's grandmother but analyzed financial data like a detective, had found things even Clara hadn't suspected. He's got a second credit card, Diane had explained during a meeting at Miranda's office. Corporate card from Whitmore Financial. He's been using it for personal expenses and claiming them as business. Restaurants, hotels, a weekend in Paris last June. Can we use that? Clara had asked. In the divorce? Maybe not directly, but his employer might be interested to know their VP of Analytics has been committing expense fraud. Diane had grinned, especially since the Paris trip coincided with a client meeting he definitely didn't attend. Miranda had made a note. We'll hold that for leverage. What else? Cryptocurrency. He's got about 30,000 pounds in Bitcoin and Ethereum, purchased over the past 2 years using joint account funds, but held in his name only. He never mentioned that. Because he didn't disclose it in his initial financial statement. That's another problem for him. The evidence had kept mounting. A second apartment Clara hadn't known about. Not for Sophie, but for Adrian himself. A bachelor pad in Shoreditch he'd rented 6 months before the divorce conversation. 2,000 pounds a month. Another hidden expense. Subscriptions to dating apps. Not just one affair. Multiple. Sophie was just the one he'd chosen to keep. Business expenses that weren't. Dinners charged to the company for client development that had actually been dates. Theater tickets, spa treatments, a weekend at a country estate. He's been living a completely separate life, Claire had said, staring at the spreadsheet Diane had created. Every expense color-coded, every lie documented. He's been planning his exit for at least a year, Miranda had corrected. The Shoreditch apartment, the hidden assets, the diversification of funds. This wasn't impulsive, this was calculated. So he was always going to leave. Probably, but he wanted to do it on his terms, control the narrative, minimize his losses, walk away looking like the reasonable one. And instead he's fucked. The word had sounded wrong coming from Miranda's elegant mouth, but accurate. As the evidence had accumulated, Adrian's behavior had escalated. The threatening text had been just the beginning. He'd started showing up at Claire's office again, demanding to talk. Security had escorted him out twice. He'd called her partners, trying to suggest she was unstable, distracted, unreliable. It had backfired spectacularly. Richard Morrison, the senior partner who'd always been lukewarm about Claire's promotion, had called her into his office after Adrian's third attempt at character assassination. Your husband called me today, he'd said without preamble. Clara's stomach had dropped. I'm sorry. I've told him to stop. He suggested we should reconsider your role on the Kensington project. Said you were going through a difficult time. Implied you might not be, focused. I understand if you need to. Clara. Richard had held up a hand. I've been practicing architecture for 35 years. I've seen a lot of divorces. Some people fall apart. You? He gestured to the designs spread across his desk. You've produced some of the best work of your career in the past month. The Kensington clients are thrilled. Your attention to detail has been impeccable. So when your soon-to-be ex-husband calls to tell me you're struggling, what I hear is a man who's panicking because his wife is succeeding without him. Clara had felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, opening. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing, and if he calls again, I'm forwarding him to our legal department. Harassment is harassment, regardless of marital status. She'd left Richard's office feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Supported, seen, valued. The preliminary trial date had been set for 6 weeks out. Miranda had filed for an expedited hearing, arguing that Adrian's continued harassment and financial misconduct warranted swift resolution. Normally, divorces take months, even years, she'd explained. But we've got enough evidence of bad faith to push for acceleration. Judge Brennan doesn't like it when people abuse the system. In the meantime, life had continued in strange ways. Clara had thrown herself into work with an intensity that surprised her. The Kensington project had evolved from a good design to something exceptional. She'd incorporated elements she'd never dared try before: sustainable materials, innovative space utilization, a rooftop garden that would actually work in London's climate. "You're designing like someone who has nothing to lose," James had observed one evening. They'd been working late, reviewing structural load calculations. "Maybe I don't. That's not a bad thing. Some of the best architecture comes from that place. When you stop caring about approval and just build what needs to exist." She'd looked at the renderings spread across her desk. He was right. She'd been designing for approval her entire career, for the partners, for clients, for Adrian, though she'd never admitted that to herself. Now she was designing for something else, for the building itself, for what it could be. The change showed. 3 weeks before the trial, Phillips had called Miranda again. Another settlement offer. This time, 70% of assets, full restitution, and an agreement that Adrian would cover all legal fees. "He's desperate," Miranda had said. "The trial date is real now. He's looking at discovery evidence that makes him look like a criminal." And Whitmore Financial received an anonymous tip about his expense fraud. Clara had smiled. "How unfortunate." "Indeed. So what do you want to do?" "What happens at trial?" "We present everything. Every hotel receipt, every lie, every hidden account. His lawyer cross-examines you, tries to make you look vindictive or unstable. We destroy that narrative. The judge rules. You probably get 75 to 80% full restitution, and he pays all fees anyway." "Probably?" "Law is never certain, but this is as close as it gets." Clara had thought about it. About sitting in a courtroom while Adrian's lawyer tried to paint her as the villain. About months more of this consuming her life. About the money, because there was a lot of money, more than she'd ever expected. About whether revenge was worth it. "Take the settlement," she'd said. Miranda had looked surprised. "You sure?" 70% is more than fair. I get restitution. I don't pay legal fees, and I never have to see him again after we sign papers. That's worth more than the extra 5% we might win at trial." "This is very mature of you. Don't sound so disappointed." "I'm not disappointed. I'm impressed. Most people in your position would want blood." "I want my life back. Blood is just expensive." The settlement had been finalized a week later. Clara had sat in Miranda's conference room, signing page after page while Adrian sat across from her, his pen moving with mechanical precision. They hadn't spoken, hadn't looked at each other except when legally required to confirm they understood what they were signing. The house was hers. The marital savings, what remained after his theft plus the restitution, was divided 70-30 in her favor. Her retirement accounts stayed intact. His investment portfolio was split, with her receiving the larger share. Total assets, just over £600,000 in her favor. After 8 years of marriage, that's what it came down to. Numbers on paper, signatures on forms. "That's it," Miranda had said when the last page was signed. "You're officially divorced. Well, you will be after the decree absolute is issued, but for all practical purposes, this is done." Clara had looked at her signature. Clara Bennett, not Clara Cole. She'd never taken his name professionally, but she'd used it socially. Mrs. Cole, Adrian's wife, not anymore. In the hallway as they'd been leaving, Adrian had caught her arm. "Clara." She'd stopped, looked at his hand on her sleeve until he'd removed it. "What?" I wanted to say I'm sorry for how this happened, for hurting you." She'd studied his face, looking for sincerity, found something that might have been regret, buried under resentment and self-pity. "You're not sorry you hurt me," she'd said. "You're sorry you got caught. Sorry it cost you. Sorry you didn't get to control how it ended. But you're not sorry for what you did. If you were, you would have stopped yourself months ago. That's not fair. Neither was stealing 50,000 pounds to fuck a 26-year-old. But here we are." He'd flinched. "I hope you find happiness. I really do. I hope you figure out why you can't." She'd walked away then, Miranda beside her, and hadn't looked back. The Kensington project had been approved 2 days after the settlement finalized. Full budget, Clara as lead architect, completion date set for 18 months out. The clients had loved her vision. The partners had been impressed. Richard Morrison had actually used the word brilliant in a firm-wide email. Clara had celebrated alone in her house now, legally and completely, with a bottle of wine that cost more than it should, and a view of London that she'd nearly forgotten was beautiful. Her phone had buzzed around midnight. A message from an unknown number. "He's moving to Manchester. New job. Fresh start. Thought you'd want to know." She hadn't responded. Hadn't needed to. Whatever informant had sent that message, maybe someone from Whitmore Financial, maybe one of Adrian's friends who'd seen through his bullshit, they'd given her the closure she hadn't realized she wanted. He was leaving. Running, really. From the wreckage of his reputation, from the consequences of his actions, from a city where everyone now knew what he'd done. Good. Clara had deleted the message and poured another glass of wine. Tomorrow she'd go back to the office. She'd refine the Kensington designs. She'd meet with contractors and engineers. She'd build something that would last longer than any marriage. But tonight, she'd sit in her house and remember who she'd been before Adrian Cole, the woman who'd graduated top of her class, who'd won design competitions and impressed skeptical professors, who'd believed she could create spaces that changed how people lived. That woman was still here. Bruised, maybe. Scarred, definitely, but still standing, and that was enough. The first month after the divorce felt like living in someone else's life. Clara would wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, reaching for a warmth that wasn't there and hadn't been for longer than she wanted to admit. Then she'd remember. The settlement. The signatures. The finality of it all. And she'd feel relief so profound it was almost painful. Work became her anchor. The Kensington project consumed her days and most of her evenings. She'd arrive at the office before 7, leave after 9, and in between she'd lose herself in elevations and material selections and structural calculations that demanded precision but offered clarity. Numbers didn't lie. Physics didn't betray you. A well-designed building would stand exactly as long as its engineering allowed. Unlike marriages. "You're going to burn out," James had warned one Thursday evening. They'd been reviewing the rooftop garden specifications for the third time because Clara couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong with the drainage system. "I'm fine." "You've said that a lot lately, still not convinced you know what it means." She'd looked up from her laptop. James was packing up his things, shoving sketchbooks and pencils into a messenger bag that had seen better days. "I like working," Clara had said. "Working or hiding?" "Maybe both." But he'd paused, considering this. "Fair enough. But you know what happens to architects who forget to live outside the blueprints? They design buildings that look impressive but feel hollow, like they're missing something human." Deep thoughts from the sustainability guy. "Mock me all you want, but I'm right. When's the last time you did something that had nothing to do with work or divorce lawyers?" Clara had tried to remember. Couldn't. "Exactly," James had said. "Come out with us tomorrow night, me and some friends from uni. Nothing fancy, just drinks and terrible conversation about things that don't matter." "I don't know, and you don't have to know. Just show up. The Admiral, 8 o'clock. If you hate it, you can leave. But at least you'll have tried something other than working yourself into an early grave." He'd left before she could argue further. Clara had stayed at the office until 11, refining the drainage system until it was perfect. Then she'd gone home to her empty house and eaten leftover takeaway in front of her laptop, reviewing contractor bids until her eyes burned. The next evening, she'd almost talked herself out of going. Had composed 3 different text messages to James explaining why she couldn't make it. Work deadline, not feeling well. Sudden crisis with the Kensington client. All lies. The truth was simpler and more embarrassing. She'd forgotten how to be around people who weren't lawyers or architects or soon-to-be ex-husbands. The thought of small talk and forced laughter made her want to hide in her house forever. But at 7:45, she'd found herself putting on jeans and a sweater, applying minimal makeup, and calling an Uber to a pub in Bloomsbury she'd never heard of. The Admiral was exactly the kind of place she'd expected. Dark wood, brass fixtures, the smell of beer and fried food, crowded enough to be anonymous, familiar enough not to feel threatening. James had waved from a corner booth where he sat with 3 other people Clara didn't recognize. "You came," he'd said, genuinely pleased. "I owe Melissa £5. She bet you'd bail." A woman with short purple hair and multiple ear piercings had extended her hand. "Melissa Chen. I lose bets regularly. Don't take it personally." Clara Bennett. "Oh, we know. James won't shut up about the Kensington project. Apparently you're some kind of design genius." James exaggerates. "I really don't," James had said, gesturing to the others. "This is Tom. He does something incomprehensible with data analytics. And Sarah, who teaches literature at UCL and thinks we're all Philistines." Tom had been mid-30s with the rumpled look of someone who spent too much time staring at screens. Sarah was younger, early 20s maybe, with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that suggested she still believed in the power of education. "What do you teach?" Claire had asked her. 20th century American fiction, currently trying to convince 19-year-olds that Hemingway isn't just about bullfighting and drinking. "Good luck with that." "I need it. Last week someone asked if Hemingway invented Twitter." The conversation had flowed easier than Claire expected. Tom had complained about his boss. Melissa had told a complicated story about a client meeting gone wrong. Sarah had ranted about student essays that used Wikipedia as their only source. Normal things, boring things, things that had nothing to do with divorce or betrayal or the weight of starting over. Clara had found herself laughing, actually laughing. Not the polite sound she'd made at firm dinners, but genuine amusement at Tom's terrible impression of his boss and Melissa's increasingly creative curse words. "So what do you do when you're not designing buildings?" Melissa had asked during a lull in the conversation. Clara had opened her mouth, then realized she had no answer. What did she do? Before the divorce, she'd gone through the motions of being a wife. Dinner parties Adrian had wanted to attend. Charity events that looked good for his career. Maintaining a house and a marriage that had been dying so slowly, she hadn't noticed until it was gone. "I work," she'd said finally. "No hobbies? Secret talents? Embarrassing obsessions?" "I used to paint, watercolors mostly. Haven't done it in years." "Why not?" "Good question." "No time, I guess." "That's code for someone told me it was a waste of time, and I believed them," Sarah had said. "I see it with my students. They come in loving books and leave thinking literature is something to be endured. Someone convinces them joy is frivolous." Clara had felt that observation land somewhere deep. Adrian had never explicitly told her to stop painting, but he'd made comments about the mess, about the expense of supplies, about how she should focus on her real career, not hobbies that wouldn't lead anywhere. She'd stopped painting 6 years ago. "You should start again," Melissa had said. "Life's too short for should-have-dones." Profoundly philosophical for someone who just lost a £5 bet. "I contain multitudes. Also, I'm slightly drunk." They'd stayed until last call, talking about nothing and everything. Clara had told them about the Kensington project, leaving out the part where it had been her lifeline during the divorce. James had shared horror stories from previous firms. Tom had explained his data work in terms that made it sound like wizardry. Sarah had recommended books Clara would never read but appreciated hearing about anyway. When the pub had finally kicked them out, they'd stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, breath fogging in the streetlight. "Same time next week?" James had asked. Clara had surprised herself by saying yes. The pattern had repeated. Friday nights at the Admiral, sometimes the same group, sometimes different people. An ever-rotating cast of James's friends and acquaintances who worked in design or tech or education or fields. Clara couldn't begin to understand. She'd learned that Melissa ran a graphic design studio and had strong opinions about typography. That Tom was actually brilliant at his job but terrible at explaining it. That Sarah was writing a dissertation on war literature and drinking too much coffee. She'd also learned that she'd been lonely, not just since Adrian left but for years before that. Living with someone who'd checked out emotionally, going through routines that looked like intimacy but felt like performance. These Friday nights weren't profound. There was no life-changing advice, no dramatic revelations, just people talking and laughing and complaining about their lives in ways that made Clara feel less alone. The Kensington project had moved into the construction phase in December. Clara had spent a freezing Tuesday morning on site, reviewing foundation work with the general contractor, a gruff man named Davies who spoke in grunts and seemed to communicate primarily through skeptical looks. "This drainage system," he'd said, gesturing at the plans. "You sure about this?" "Positive." "Seems complicated." "It's necessary. The water table in this area is high, and with the rooftop garden we need to ensure proper runoff without compromising the structural integrity," Davies had grunted, which apparently meant agreement because he'd turned to his crew and started barking orders. Claire had watched the foundation take shape, steel and concrete forming the skeleton of her design. There was something visceral about seeing a building emerge from blueprints, proof that her ideas could become reality. Her phone had buzzed. A message from Miranda. "Thought you'd want to know. Adrian's filed for bankruptcy. His Manchester job fell through. Couldn't keep up with the debt from the settlement plus his own legal fees." Clara had stared at the message for a long moment. She'd expected to feel satisfaction, victory, some kind of vindication that the man who'd betrayed her was suffering consequences. Instead, she'd felt nothing. Not pity, not pleasure, just a vast indifference. "Good to know," she'd typed back. "Thanks for letting me know." She'd deleted the message thread and returned to watching Davies' crew pour concrete. This, the building, the work, the future she was constructing mattered more than Adrian's failures. The holidays had approached with the inevitability of winter. Clara had dreaded them. 8 years of shared traditions, of forced family dinners with Adrian's parents, of pretending everything was fine while carving turkey and making small talk. This year, she'd been invited nowhere. Adrian's family had understandably sided with him, regardless of the facts. Her own parents were dead, her mother from cancer when Clara was 23, her father from a heart attack 2 years later. She had a brother in Australia she spoke to maybe twice a year, and a few cousins scattered across England she'd lost touch with. The realization that she had no one to spend Christmas with had hit her on December 20th. She'd been in her office watching snow begin to fall over London when Melissa had knocked on her door. "Quick question. Are you doing anything for Christmas?" "Working, probably." "Wrong answer. You're coming to mine. My family does this massive chaotic dinner thing. Too much food, too many people, questionable decisions about alcohol, very loud, moderately embarrassing, completely non-optional." "I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding. I'm inviting. There's a difference. Besides, my mom always cooks for twice as many people as actually show up. You'd be doing us a favor by helping eat it all." Clara had tried to argue, but Melissa had the same stubborn determination she probably used on difficult clients. Christmas Day had been exactly as advertised. Melissa's family lived in a row house in Brixton that seemed to contain approximately 800 people, though it was probably closer to 20. Her parents, 2 brothers, a sister, various partners and children, friends who'd become honorary family, and a grandmother who sat in a corner armchair like a matriarch surveying her kingdom. "You must be Clara," Melissa's mother had said, pulling her into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and wine. "Melissa says you design buildings. How wonderful. We need more women in architecture. My sister wanted to be an architect, but her father said it wasn't suitable. Can you imagine? This was the 70s, mind you, but still." Clara had been swept into the chaos. Assigned to peel potatoes in a kitchen where 3 different conversations happened simultaneously. Handed a glass of mulled wine. Introduced to people whose names she'd immediately forgotten. Dragged into a debate about whether Die Hard counted as a Christmas film. It had been overwhelming and strange, and nothing like the quiet, controlled holidays she'd spent with Adrian. His family had done Christmas with the same precision they approached everything. Scheduled arrival times, assigned seating, conversations that followed acceptable topics. This was messy. People talked over each other. Children ran through the house shrieking. Someone burned the rolls. Melissa's brother told an inappropriate joke that made the grandmother laugh so hard she needed her inhaler. Clara had found herself relaxing, laughing at things that weren't particularly funny, eating too much, losing track of time in a way she hadn't in years. "You doing okay?" Melissa had asked, around 9, finding Clara on the back porch where she'd escaped for air. Yeah, this is really nice. Thank you for inviting me. My pleasure. You looked like you needed some chaos in your life. I didn't realize how much. Adrian's family was the stick up the ass type, wasn't it? Clara had laughed. Extremely. I dated a guy like that once. His family did Christmas with place cards and a printed agenda. An agenda, Clara, for Christmas dinner. I lasted one holiday season before I realized I'd rather be alone than that miserable. How long did it take you to leave? About 6 months after that Christmas. Kept making excuses. He was nice, we had history, maybe I was being too picky. Finally, my mom sat me down and asked if I actually liked him or if I just liked the idea of not being single. Melissa had shrugged. Turned out it was the latter. What did you do? Ended it. Felt terrible for about a week. Then I felt free. Best decision I ever made. They'd stood in comfortable silence, watching snow fall into the small garden. Inside, someone had started playing piano, badly. Can I ask you something? Melissa had said. Sure. Are you actually okay? Like, really okay, not just saying it? Clara had considered the question seriously. Was she okay? The divorce was finalized. The settlement had given her financial stability. Work was going well. She had Friday nights at the Admiral and apparently chaotic Christmas dinners now. But she still woke up at 3 a.m. sometimes, heart racing, mind spiraling. Still caught herself thinking in terms of we and our before remembering there was no we anymore. Still felt the absence of something she couldn't quite name. I'm getting there, she'd said finally. Some days are better than others. That's honest, at least. Progress? Not perfection, right? Exactly. The new year had arrived with the usual fanfare and hollow promises. Clara had spent New Year's Eve at another pub gathering, this time watching James get progressively drunker while insisting he wasn't drunk. At midnight, strangers had hugged and kissed and made resolutions they wouldn't keep. Clara had stood slightly apart from it all, wondering who she was becoming. Not Adrian's wife. Not the woman who'd walked into that restaurant and had her life shattered. Someone else. Someone still forming. Work had intensified in January. The Kensington building's steel frame had started going up, and Clara had spent hours on site, consulting with structural engineers about beam placements and load calculations. The rooftop garden remained her pet project, the element she'd fought hardest for, and the one that would make or break the building's reputation. You're putting a lot of faith in some plants, Davies had grumbled during one inspection. It's not just plants, it's a functional ecosystem, green space in an area that desperately needs it, plus the thermal benefits, the stormwater management. You sound like a brochure. I wrote the brochure. He'd almost smiled, which for Davies was practically a declaration of love. The Admiral gatherings had continued, evolving into something like friendship. Clara had learned that Tom was going through his own divorce, though he rarely talked about it, that Sarah was considering leaving academia, that Melissa's design studio was struggling financially, but she refused to give up. They'd learned things about Clara, too, that she had opinions about coffee that bordered on pretentious, that she couldn't hold her liquor as well as she thought, that she'd once wanted to be a painter, but had let someone convince her it wasn't practical. My ex did that, Tom had said one night, nursing a beer. Made me feel like everything I enjoyed was stupid or childish. I used to collect vinyl records. Loved music. He said it was a waste of money and space, so I sold the collection. All of it. Hundreds of records I'd spent years finding. And you know what? I still regret it. Not him. The records. That's bleak, James had said. It's honest. Relationships make you into people you don't recognize. The lucky ones figure it out before it's permanent. Claire had thought about her watercolors, packed away in the attic. About all the small pieces of herself she'd abandoned to make room for Adrian's preferences, Adrian's schedule, Adrian's life. The next weekend she'd climbed into the attic and retrieved the boxes. Brushes and paints, most dried out. Sketchbooks filled with attempts from years ago. Some good, some terrible. All proof she'd once been someone who created for the simple joy of it. She'd set up a small studio in the spare bedroom. Nothing fancy. Just a desk by the window and supplies ordered from an art store that cost less than one of Adrian's dinners at Aurelius. The first painting had been terrible. Clumsy brushwork, muddy colors, composition that made her wince. She'd almost thrown it away. Instead, she'd started another one. By February, the spare room had become her refuge. She'd paint on weekend mornings before the day's obligations crowded in. Landscapes, mostly. Nothing profound. Just practice, remembering what her hands could do when she wasn't designing for clients or deadlines. "You're painting again," James had observed, noticing paint under her fingernails during a site meeting. "Trying to." "Good. You needed something that was just yours." The Kensington project had hit its first major snag in March. The rooftop garden's irrigation system wasn't working the way Clara had designed it. Water pressure was inconsistent, some sections were flooding while others stayed dry, and the whole thing threatened to turn her signature element into an expensive disaster. "We need to rethink this," Davies had said, showing her the problem. "Maybe simplify, use conventional irrigation instead of your integrated system." No. Clara had studied the plans, looking for what she'd missed. "The design works. We must have missed something in the installation. Or the design is too complicated. The design is fine. Clara, give me a week. I'll figure it out." She'd spent the next 5 days obsessively reviewing calculations, consulting with hydraulic engineers, cross-referencing her original plans with what had actually been built. The answer had finally come at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, staring at specifications until her eyes crossed. The contractors had installed the wrong gauge piping in one section. A simple mistake, easy to overlook. But it had created a cascade effect that threw off the entire system's pressure balance. "Here," she'd told Davies the next morning, showing him the error. "Replace this section with the correct piping. Everything else will work." He'd studied the plans, then looked at her with something approaching respect. "You were right. I usually am about my designs. Humble, too. I contain multitudes." The correction had taken a week, but once implemented, the irrigation system had functioned exactly as Clara had intended, water flowing where it should, the garden beginning to take shape, her vision becoming reality. Richard Morrison had visited the site in April. He'd walked through the building slowly, examining every detail, asking questions about material choices and structural decisions. Clara had followed, trying to read his expression. "This is excellent work," he'd said finally, standing in what would become the main lobby. "Innovative without being flashy, practical without being boring. It's exactly what this neighborhood needs." "Thank you. I wanted to discuss something with you. The board is considering opening a satellite office in Bristol. We need someone to head it, someone with vision and the ability to manage complex projects." He'd paused. "I'm recommending you." Clara had stared at him. What?" "It's a promotion, significant increase in responsibility and salary. You'd have autonomy to build your own team, take on projects that interest you. Of course, it would mean relocating to Bristol, which I understand is asking a lot." "Can I think about it?" "Take your time. But Clara, you've earned this. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." She'd driven home in a daze. A promotion, a fresh start, a chance to build something entirely her own. Also, leaving London, leaving the house she'd fought to keep, leaving Friday nights at the Admiral and the fragile social connection she'd started rebuilding. That night she'd sat in her studio, staring at a half-finished painting of the Thames at sunset. The decision should have been obvious. Career advancement, financial security, escape from a city full of memories she'd rather forget. But London wasn't just Adrian anymore. It was the Kensington building, rising from its foundation. It was Melissa's chaotic family dinners. It was this house, these rooms she'd made her own again. It was learning to be someone other than a wife or an ex-wife. Her phone had rung. Unknown number. Against her better judgment, she'd answered. "Clara, it's Sophie." The world had tilted slightly. "Sophie Laurent?" "Yeah, Look, I know this is weird, but I needed to talk to you." "How did you get this number?" "Adrian gave it to me, before everything fell apart. I've been wanting to call for months, but I didn't know if I should." Clara had said nothing, waiting. "He's in bad shape," Sophie had continued. "The bankruptcy, the job loss, everything. He blames you for all of it." "Of course he does. But I know that's not fair. I know what really happened." A pause. "I know what he did." "Then why are you calling me?" "Because I'm 26 and stupid, and I got involved with a married man because he told me his wife didn't understand him, and I believed it. And now I'm sitting here realizing I destroyed someone's marriage for a guy who lies about everything. Sophie's voice had cracked. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth. Clara had closed her eyes. Are you still with him? No, I left after the bankruptcy. Couldn't handle the bitterness. A bitter laugh. Turns out I wasn't as mature as I thought. None of us are. He told me you were cold, unfeeling, that you didn't care about him anymore. That's what he needed to believe. Were you happy before I came along? The question had hung in the air. Claire had thought about it honestly, about the years of growing distance, the routines that had replaced intimacy, the slow suffocation of a marriage that had been dying long before Sophie Laurent sent her first flirtatious text. No, Claire had said finally. I wasn't, but that didn't give him the right to do what he did, and it didn't give you the right to help him. I know. Is there a point to this call, Sophie? I guess I just needed to hear your voice to make you real instead of just the villain in Adrian's story. Well, now you have. For what it's worth, I think you're better off without him. I think we both are. Clara had ended the call without responding, sat in the silence of her studio, processing the conversation. Sophie's apology had meant nothing, but her admission that Adrian was bitter, blaming, unable to accept responsibility, confirmed what Clara had already known. He would never change, would never understand, would spend the rest of his life believing he'd been wronged instead of confronting what he'd done. And Clara would spend hers building something better. She'd picked up her brush and returned to the painting. The Bristol decision had consumed Clara for 2 weeks. She'd made lists, pros and cons in careful columns that should have made the answer obvious. Career advancement, higher salary, clean slate in a city where no one knew about Adrian or the divorce or the woman she'd been before. But London kept pulling her back. The Kensington building would finish in 6 months. She'd poured everything into that project. Leaving before completion felt like abandoning a child. You're overthinking this, Melissa had said over coffee one Saturday. They'd started meeting on weekends, just the two of them. Conversations that ranged from design philosophy to relationship disasters to whether avocado toast was actually worth 12 pounds. I'm being thorough. You're being scared. There's a difference. Clara had stirred her coffee, watching cream swirl into patterns. What if I make the wrong choice? Then you make a different choice later. Nothing's permanent except death and bad tattoos. That's not helpful. Sure it is. You're acting like this decision defines your entire future. Maybe it's just a decision. Maybe Bristol is great. Maybe it isn't. Maybe you stay in London and regret it. Maybe you don't. But either way, you're going to be fine. How do you know? Melissa had leaned back, considering. Because 6 months ago, you were signing divorce papers and probably wondering if you'd ever feel normal again. And now you're sitting here stressing about a promotion and drinking overpriced coffee with a friend. You've already survived the worst thing. Everything else is just logistics. Clara had wanted to believe that, had tried to let the words settle into the anxious space in her chest, but doubt had become her constant companion lately. Second-guessing every decision, analyzing every choice until paralysis set in. She'd declined the Bristol position on a Tuesday morning, called Richard Morrison and thanked him for the opportunity, but explained she couldn't leave London right now. He'd been understanding, even sympathetic. The Kensington project, he'd said. You want to see it through? I need to. I respect that. The offer stands if you change your mind, but Clara, don't let one building define your entire career. You're capable of more than you realize. The conversation had stayed with her, more than you realize. When had she stopped believing in her own capabilities? When had Adrian's constant subtle criticisms, you're too emotional, too impractical, too focused on things that don't matter, become the voice in her head? The Kensington building had continued its transformation through spring. Walls went up, windows were installed, the rooftop garden began to take actual shape, plants arriving in enormous containers while Clara supervised their placement with the intensity of a general deploying troops. That hydrangea needs to be 6 inches to the left, she'd told the landscaping crew. The foreman had given her a look. It's a plant. It's a plant that will eventually grow and block the sight line to the river if it's positioned incorrectly. 6 inches left. He'd moved it without further argument. Davies had watched this exchange with barely concealed amusement. You're terrifying when you care about something. Good. Meant as a compliment. The building's completion date had been set for late September. 8 years of marriage had ended in signatures and legal documents. 8 months of work was becoming something tangible and permanent. The symmetry wasn't lost on Clara. Friday nights at the Admiral had evolved into something Clara actually looked forward to. The group had expanded and contracted over months. A fluid collection of people united mainly by their connection to James and their willingness to drink mediocre beer while debating increasingly absurd topics. I'm just saying, Tom had argued one evening in May, if you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, potatoes are objectively the best choice. Nutritionally complete, versatile preparation methods. You can't live on only potatoes, Sarah had interrupted. That's not how nutrition works. Tell that to the Irish. Tom, you cannot use the potato famine as evidence for your argument. That's the opposite of evidence. Clara had laughed, genuinely amused by their commitment to this ridiculous debate. James had caught her eye and grinned. Having fun? He'd asked later, when they'd stepped outside for air. Surprisingly, yes. You say that like it's unexpected. It is. I spent so many years being social because I had to. Firm dinners, charity events, networking. It all felt like work. This doesn't. That's because no one here wants anything from you except your company. Well, and your occasional architectural expertise when Tom tries to argue about building codes he doesn't understand. They'd stood in comfortable silence, watching taxis cruise past on the wet street. Rain earlier had left everything gleaming. Can I ask you something personal? James had said. Depends on the question. Do you regret it? The marriage? Clara had considered this. The easy answer was yes. 8 years wasted on someone who'd betrayed her. But the truth was more complicated. I regret how it ended, she'd said slowly. I regret not seeing what was happening sooner. But I don't know if I regret the whole thing. I learned what I don't want, what I won't accept. That's worth something. Very mature of you. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not. You've always been more put together than you give yourself credit for. She'd looked at him, really looked. James, with his perpetually messy hair and his enthusiasm for sustainable design and his terrible jokes that somehow made her laugh anyway. They'd been working together for over a year, friends for nearly as long. Why didn't you ever say anything? Claire had asked. About Adrian being awful. You said you always thought he was a prick. Because you loved him. Or thought you did. And people can't hear the truth when they're not ready for it. They just get defensive and angry. I figured you'd realize it eventually. That's very patient. I'm very patient about things that matter. Something in his tone had made Clara look at him more carefully, but James had already turned away, pulling out his phone to check a message. The moment had passed. June had brought a heat wave that made London miserable. The Kensington site had become an oven. Workers had started earlier to avoid midday heat. Clara had spent mornings on site in a hard hat and growing frustration as minor issues kept emerging. Wrong tile color in the lobby. Lighting fixtures delayed by 3 weeks. A client who kept changing their mind about interior paint. This is normal, Davies had assured her during one particularly trying morning. Every project hits this phase. Everything that can go wrong does. Then suddenly, it all comes together. When? Eventually. Not helpful. Clara had escaped to her studio that evening, desperate for something she controlled completely. She'd been working on a series of London landscapes, the city as she saw it now. Not tourist brochure London, but the version she'd discovered while rebuilding her life. Quiet streets in Bloomsbury. The Admiral's worn exterior. The view from her bedroom window at dawn. The paintings were getting better. She'd never be a professional artist, but that wasn't the point. The point was creating something that existed only because she wanted it to exist. Her phone had buzzed. A message from an unknown number, which these days usually meant spam or someone who'd gotten the wrong contact. Hi, Clara. This is probably weird, but I'm Michael Hayes. I teach architecture at UCL with Sarah Chen. She mentioned you might be willing to speak to my students about commercial design. Clara had stared at the message. Sarah taught literature, not architecture. But apparently Sarah had connections Clara didn't know about. She'd typed back, I've never done public speaking, not sure I'd be any good at it. The response had come quickly. Neither are most of my guest speakers, but they show up and talk about buildings, and the students love it. No pressure, but I think you'd be great. Sarah speaks very highly of you. Clara had set down her phone and returned to her painting, but the idea had nagged at her. Speaking to students, sharing what she'd learned, being someone other than the architect who'd gotten divorced and survived. She'd replied the next morning, "What would you want me to talk about?" The speaking engagement had been scheduled for late July. Clara had spent 2 weeks preparing a presentation about the Kensington project, complete with renderings and photographs of the construction process. She'd practiced her remarks until they sounded natural, rewritten slides until they were perfect. The night before the lecture, she'd barely slept. The classroom had been smaller than she'd expected. Maybe 40 students, most of them looking young and exhausted in that specific way that suggested late nights and too much caffeine. Michael Hayes had introduced her with enthusiasm that felt generous given they'd only spoken on the phone. Clara Bennett is the lead architect on the Kensington project, which many of you have probably walked past without realizing it's about to become one of the most innovative, sustainable buildings in central London. Clara had stepped forward, looked at the sea of faces, and felt her carefully prepared remarks evaporate from her mind. "So," she'd started, then stopped, regrouped. "I'm not a teacher. I'm just someone who designs buildings and tries not to make them fall down." A few students had laughed. The tension in Clara's shoulders had eased slightly. "I was going to talk to you about the technical aspects of the Kensington project. Sustainable materials, innovative drainage systems, all the things that make it architecturally interesting. But honestly, the technical stuff is easy. The hard part is learning to trust your vision when everyone else thinks you're wrong." She'd clicked to the next slide, the rooftop garden in its planning phase. This garden almost didn't happen. The clients thought it was too expensive. The contractors thought it was too complicated. My senior partners thought it was too risky for a commercial building. I spent 6 months fighting to keep it in the design, and there were days I wondered if they were right, if I was being stubborn instead of smart. Another slide. The garden as it existed now, lush and functional and exactly what she'd envisioned. But I knew the building needed it, not just for sustainability metrics or aesthetic value, because buildings should give something back to the people who use them. This garden will be public space, free to access, green space in an area that desperately needs it, that matters more than construction efficiency or budget concerns. She talked for 45 minutes, about fighting for her ideas, about the divorce that had happened parallel to this project, though she didn't name Adrian or give details, about learning to trust herself when the world kept suggesting she shouldn't. When she'd finished, the room had been quiet. Then one student had raised her hand. "How do you deal with people who don't take you seriously because you're a woman?" Clara had smiled. "Honestly, I design buildings so good they can't be ignored. And when that doesn't work, I get very comfortable with being called difficult." The students had laughed. More questions had followed, about sustainable design, about working with difficult clients, about how to know when to compromise and when to hold firm. Afterward, several students had approached with follow-up questions. One young woman had lingered until the others left. "Thank you for being honest about the personal stuff," she'd said quietly. "My parents are going through a divorce. Everyone acts like I should just focus on school and pretend it's not happening. Like being upset is unprofessional. It's not unprofessional to be human." "My professors don't seem to think so." "Then your professors are wrong." Clara had paused. "The divorce happened while I was working on the most important project of my career. I could have fallen apart. Sometimes I wanted to, but I also realized that I got to choose what defined me. The marriage that ended or the building I was creating. I chose the building." The student had nodded, eyes bright. "I'm choosing architecture too." "Good. We need more people who give a damn." Michael Hayes had taken Clara for coffee afterward. They'd talked about his students, about the challenges of teaching creativity, about the state of architecture education. "You're a natural at this," he'd said. "Have you considered teaching?" "Never crossed my mind." "It should. The students responded to you because you were real. Most guest lecturers come in and talk at them about their achievements. You talk to them about your failures and doubts. That's what they need to hear." Clara had filed that thought away, unsure what to do with it. The summer had passed in a blur of construction deadlines and Friday nights and slow progress on paintings that would never be displayed anywhere but her walls. The Kensington building had moved toward completion with the kind of momentum that felt inevitable. Systems tested, interiors finished, The rooftop garden flourishing under the care of the landscaping team Clara had personally vetted. In August, James had shown up at her door on a Sunday afternoon. Clara had been painting, covered in watercolor stains and wearing clothes she wouldn't be caught dead in at the office. "You look very artistic," he'd said. "You look very unannounced. What's up?" "I need a favor. Actually, I need you to be honest with me about something." Clara had set down her brush. "Okay. Do you think about us?" The question had landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading. "What do you mean?" "I mean us, you and me. Whether there could be something more than Friday night drinks and work discussions." James had run a hand through his hair, nervous in a way she'd never seen him. "I've been trying to ignore it, because you were married, then divorced, then clearly not ready for anything. And I didn't want to be that guy who swoops in during a vulnerable moment. James, let me finish. I like you, have for a while. Not because I think I can fix you or save you or any of that patronizing bullshit, just because I like who you are, how you think, how you care about things. And I know the timing is terrible and maybe I'm an idiot for saying anything, but I need to know if there's any possibility you might feel the same way." Clara had stood there, paint-stained and surprised and completely unprepared for this conversation. She'd thought about James, of course she had, about his laugh and his terrible jokes and the way he understood her work in a way Adrian never had. But she'd also thought about how her last relationship had ended, about the ways she'd lost herself trying to be what someone else needed, about whether she even knew who she was outside of being someone's wife or ex-wife or colleague. "I don't know," she'd said honestly. "I like you too. But I don't know if I can be what you're looking for. I'm still figuring out who I am without Adrian, and I don't want to drag someone else into that mess." "That's fair. Is it? Because it feels like a cop-out." James had stepped closer, not touching, just present. "It's honest, and I'll take honest over easy any day. I'm not asking you to figure everything out right now. I'm just asking you to think about it. And if the answer is no, that's okay. We'll still be friends. I'll still make terrible jokes, and you'll still pretend not to find them funny." "I don't pretend." "You absolutely do." Clara had smiled despite herself. "Give me time." "Take all the time you need." He'd left, and Clara had returned to her painting with hands that shook slightly. She'd ruined the piece she'd been working on, colors bleeding where they shouldn't, composition falling apart. She'd started a new one instead. The Kensington building had reached substantial completion in mid-September. The official opening was scheduled for October, but the structure itself was finished. Clara had walked through it alone one evening after the workers had left, moving through spaces she'd designed but never seen fully realized. The lobby with its sustainable materials and natural light, the offices with their innovative climate control, the rooftop garden with its carefully planned ecosystem, every detail exactly as she'd envisioned, or better than she'd dared hope. She'd stood in the garden as the sun set over London, watching the city turn gold and amber. This building would outlast her marriage by decades, would stand long after everyone had forgotten about Adrian Cole and his affairs and his bankruptcy. This was her legacy, not a failed relationship, but something she'd built with her own hands and mind and stubborn refusal to compromise. Her phone had rung. "Miranda. Thought you'd want to know. Adrian filed an appeal on the settlement, claims he was coerced into accepting unfair terms." Clara had closed her eyes. "Of course he did. His lawyer is some cut-rate firm in Manchester. They're arguing emotional duress and claiming you manipulated him." "That's ridiculous." "It's also going nowhere. The settlement was reviewed by a judge. He had legal representation. The evidence of his financial misconduct is documented. This is a desperation move." "So what happens now?" "We file a response. The court dismisses his appeal. He wastes more money he doesn't have. Clara, this is going to be fine." "He's thrashing because he can't accept that he lost." After the call ended, Claire had stayed in the garden until full dark, thinking about Adrian in his Manchester apartment, bitter and broke and still convinced he was the victim, still unable to see his own role in the destruction. She'd felt sorry for him, briefly, then she'd felt nothing at all. That was progress. The Kensington opening in October had been everything Clara had hoped for. Press coverage, enthusiastic clients, Richard Morrison praising her vision in front of everyone who mattered. The rooftop garden had been the highlight, exactly as she'd planned. She'd stood at the edge of the garden during the reception, watching people marvel at what she'd created, and felt something close to peace. "Congratulations," a voice had said behind her. Clara had turned to find a man she didn't recognize. Mid-40s, friendly face, holding a glass of wine like he actually knew how to appreciate it. "Thank you. I'm Daniel Wright. I run a nonprofit that builds affordable housing. I've been following this project for months. The sustainable elements, the public garden, this is exactly the kind of thinking we need in social housing." "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's self-interest. I'd like to hire you. We're planning a development in East London. 3 buildings, mixed-income housing, with a focus on environmental sustainability and community space. Your approach would be perfect." Claire had felt her heart rate pick up. A new project, a chance to apply everything she'd learned to work that actually mattered. "I'd need to discuss it with my firm." "Of course, but think about it. We need architects who care about more than profit margins." He'd given her his card and disappeared into the crowd. Clara had stared at it, feeling the weight of possibility. James had found her later, champagne in hand. "Brilliant work," he'd said. "This building is going to win awards." "Maybe." "Definitely. So what's next for the unstoppable Clara Bennett?" She'd looked at Daniel Wright's card, at the garden she'd fought to create, at James with his hopeful expression and his terrible timing and his genuine friendship. "I have no idea," she'd said. "But I think that's okay." "Progress?" "Yeah, progress." They'd stood together in the garden she'd built, surrounded by evidence of everything she'd survived and created. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and terrifying and full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in years, Clara wasn't afraid of not knowing. She was ready to find out. The meeting with Daniel Wright's nonprofit had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November. Clara had arrived at their offices in Hackney to find a converted warehouse that looked like it had been decorated by people who actually cared about community rather than aesthetics. Mismatched furniture, walls covered in architectural renderings, and photographs of completed projects. A coffee station that consisted of a battered espresso machine and mugs that didn't match. "Sorry about the chaos," Daniel had said, leading her through to a conference room that was slightly less chaotic. "We spend most of our budget on actual housing, not making ourselves look impressive." "I like it. It's honest." 3 other people had joined the meeting. An engineer named Priya, who specialized in sustainable systems. A community organizer named Marcus, who'd grown up in East London and had strong opinions about what the neighborhood needed. And Daniel's co-founder, a woman named Helen, who asked questions that cut straight through bullshit. "The Kensington building is beautiful," Helen had said after the introductions. "But it's also a boutique hotel for people with money. We're talking about housing for people who work 3 jobs and still can't afford rent. Different stakes, different constraints. Why should we trust you with this?" Clara had appreciated the directness. "Because I'm done designing buildings that only serve people who can afford them. I got into architecture because I wanted to create spaces that made people's lives better. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. This project would remind me." "That's a nice sentiment, but we need more than sentiment. You need someone who knows how to fight for design elements that matter even when they're expensive or complicated. The Kensington Garden almost got cut because it seemed impractical. I fought to keep it. Not because it looked good in renderings, but because people need green space. Your residents need that even more than hotel guests do." Helen had exchanged a look with Daniel. "What would you do differently, knowing this is affordable housing?" Claire had thought about it. Everything and nothing. Same commitment to sustainability and quality, but simpler materials. More focus on communal spaces where people actually gather. Less about impressing and more about functioning. I'd want to talk to the people who will actually live there. Find out what they need, not what I think they should want. Marcus had leaned forward. "Most architects don't bother asking. They just decide what's best and build it. Most architects are working for clients who don't have to live in their buildings. That's the problem." The meeting had lasted 3 hours. By the end, Clara had agreed to develop preliminary designs. No commitment yet, but a chance to prove she understood what this project needed to be. She'd left feeling energized in a way work hadn't made her feel in months. The Kensington building had been a triumph, but it had also been safe. A boutique hotel for wealthy clients. This would be different, harder, more meaningful. Richard Morrison had been less enthusiastic when she'd briefed him the next day. Affordable housing is admirable, he'd said carefully, but it's also low-margin work, and housing projects have a tendency to become political nightmares, community opposition, planning disputes, budget overruns. I know the risks. Do you? Because I'm looking at your career trajectory and seeing someone poised for major commercial work, international clients, prestige projects. This would be a detour. Maybe I want a detour? Richard had studied her over his desk. This is about more than architecture, isn't it? You're trying to prove something. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of designing buildings for people who already have everything. Admirable. Also potentially career suicide. I'll take that risk. He'd sighed. You're as stubborn as you are talented. Fine. Develop the preliminary designs. But Clara? If this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you. The East London project had consumed Clara's autumn. She'd spent weeks in community meetings, listening to residents talk about what they needed. Better insulation, soundproofing, storage space. Places for kids to play that weren't just an afterthought. Accessible design for elderly residents. Security without feeling like a fortress. The list had been long and expensive. Clara had worked with Priya to find solutions that didn't compromise quality. Triple glazed windows from a manufacturer willing to offer bulk discounts. Community spaces that did double duty. A rooftop garden even more ambitious than Kensington's, designed to be maintained by residents rather than paid staff. You're going to bankrupt us before we even break ground, Helen had said during one design review, but she'd been smiling. I'm going to give you a building people are proud to live in. Those aren't mutually exclusive? They shouldn't be. The preliminary designs had been approved in December, full project greenlit for the following year. 3 buildings, 60 units total, more sustainable features than any affordable housing project in London. Clara's biggest challenge and potentially her biggest failure. She'd celebrated with the Friday night group at the Admiral. Tom had bought a round of drinks. Melissa had made a toast that was mostly curse words and affection. Sarah had quoted something from a novel Clara didn't recognize, but that sounded appropriately profound. James had caught her eye across the table and smiled. They hadn't talked about his confession from August. The moment had passed, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of friendship and work. But something had shifted, an awareness that sat between them like a question neither was ready to ask. Christmas had approached with less dread than the previous year. Melissa's family had invited her again. Clara had accepted without hesitation. The day had been exactly as chaotic as she'd remembered. Too much food, too many people. Melissa's grandmother holding court and dispensing wisdom that ranged from profound to completely absurd. Someone had brought a new boyfriend who'd looked overwhelmed until Melissa's younger brother had gotten him drunk enough to relax. Clara had helped in the kitchen again, peeling vegetables alongside Melissa's mother, while 3 conversations happened simultaneously around them. You look happier this year, Melissa's mother had observed, attacking a pile of carrots with efficient knife work. I feel happier. Good. Last Christmas you looked like someone going through the motions. This year you look like someone who wants to be here. I do. Melissa says you're working on affordable housing now. That's wonderful. We need more people who care about that. They talked about the project, about Clara's designs, about the challenges of creating quality housing with limited budgets. Melissa's mother had listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed she understood more about architecture than Clara had expected. My father was a builder, she'd explained. Nothing fancy, council flats mostly, but he cared about doing it right. Said people deserved to live in places that didn't fall apart after 5 years. She'd paused, knife still. He would have liked you. The comment had settled in Clara's chest like warmth. Approval from a stranger's dead father shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Later, after dinner, Clara had found herself on the back porch again with Melissa. Snow had started falling, fat flakes that melted on contact. So, Melissa had said, James, what about him? Don't play dense, it's beneath you. He told you how he feels and you've been pretending it didn't happen for 4 months. I'm not pretending, I'm being careful. Careful is good. Cowardly is bad. Which one is this? Clara had watched snow fall into the garden. I don't know, maybe both. I like James, but I also liked Adrian once, and look how that turned out. James is not Adrian. I know that. But what if I'm the problem? What if I don't know how to be in a relationship without losing myself? Melissa had been quiet for a moment. You know what I think? I think you're scared that being with someone means going back to being the person you were, the one who compromised and accommodated and slowly disappeared. But Clara, you're not that person anymore. The divorce broke you open. You rebuilt yourself different, stronger. You don't have to protect yourself from James. You have to decide if you want to let him in. What if I'm not ready? Then you're not ready. But don't use fear as an excuse. Be honest with him. Be honest with yourself. And if the answer is no, then fine. But make it an actual decision instead of just avoiding one. The new year had arrived with Clara still avoiding decisions. She'd thrown herself into the East London project with the kind of intensity that Melissa had rightly called hiding. Site surveys, community consultations, endless revisions to make the designs work within budget constraints. James had been assigned to the project as sustainability consultant, which meant they'd work together daily, navigating the complicated space between friendship and something undefined. We need to talk about the HVAC system, he'd said one afternoon in late January. They'd been alone in the conference room, spreadsheets covering every surface. What about it? It's over-engineered for the budget. We can achieve the same efficiency with a simpler system. Clara had reviewed his calculations. He was right, but simplifying meant losing some features she'd wanted. The heat recovery ventilation can be added later if budget allows, but right now it's a luxury we can't afford. She'd wanted to argue, had opened her mouth to defend her design. Then she'd stopped, looked at the numbers, realized he was right. Okay, she'd said. We'll simplify. James had looked surprised. Really? No fight? You made a good argument. I can admit when I'm wrong. Character growth. I'm impressed. They'd worked in silence for a few minutes. Then James had set down his pen. We should probably talk about the other thing, too. Claire's stomach had tightened. What other thing? Don't. We've been dancing around this for months. I told you how I felt. You asked for time. I gave you time. But I need to know where we stand. She'd looked at him, really looked. James with his rumpled shirt and his earnest expression and his complete lack of game playing. Nothing like Adrian. Nothing like the man who'd lied and manipulated and treated their marriage like a business transaction. I'm terrified, she'd said. Of me? Of getting it wrong again. Of losing myself trying to be what someone else needs. Of waking up 5 years from now and realizing I've made the same mistakes. I'm not asking you to be anything except yourself. Everyone says that. Then they start wanting you to change. James had leaned back, thinking. Fair point. So let me be specific. I like that you're obsessive about work. I like that you care too much about things other people think don't matter. I like that you're stubborn and sometimes difficult and completely incapable of compromising on your vision. Those aren't things I want to change. They're things I like about you. What if I'm a disaster at relationships? Then we'll be a disaster together. Clara, I'm not offering you perfection. I'm offering you honesty. We'll probably fight about work. You'll probably drive me crazy with your perfectionism. I'll probably annoy you with my terrible jokes, but we'll figure it out, or we won't. But at least we'll try. Clara had felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, opening. Okay, she'd said. Okay. Let's try. James had smiled, genuinely delighted. Yeah? Yeah, but slowly. And if I freak out, which I probably will, you have to be patient. I can do patient. He'd reached across the table and taken her hand. Simple touch. Nothing dramatic. But Clara had felt it anyway. The possibility of something different, something better. They'd started dating, though calling it that felt too formal for what it actually was. Coffee before work. Dinners that ran late. Walks through the city while debating architecture and sustainability and whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Time that felt easy instead of performative. This is weird, Clara had said one evening in February. They'd been at her house cooking dinner together in a kitchen that had once been a monument to her failed marriage. Weird bad or weird good? Weird good. Weird like I keep waiting for it to feel hard and it doesn't. Maybe that's what it's supposed to feel like. When it's right. I don't have a great track record with knowing what's right. James had stopped chopping vegetables and turned to face her. You stayed in a bad marriage because you didn't trust your instincts. Now you're second-guessing a good thing for the same reason. At some point, you have to trust yourself. What if I'm wrong? Then you're wrong. But Clara, you rebuilt your entire life in a year. You fought a divorce battle and won. You designed a building that's getting written up in architecture journals. You took on a housing project that every other architect said was impossible. You're not wrong about yourself. Stop pretending you are. She'd kissed him then, first real kiss. It had felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. The East London project had broken ground in March. Clara had stood at the site on a cold morning, watching machinery clear the ground, and felt the weight of responsibility. 60 families would eventually live here, their homes, their safety, their daily lives shaped by decisions she made now. Nervous? Helen had asked, appearing beside her. Terrified. Good. You should be. This matters. They'd worked together over the following months, navigating the endless complications of building affordable housing, budget fights, planning disputes, community members who supported the project, and community members convinced it would ruin the neighborhood, politicians who wanted credit without providing funding. Clara had learned to fight different battles, not for prestige or awards, but for the basics. Safe materials, adequate heating, windows that actually opened, things that shouldn't have been battles, but somehow were. You're getting political, Richard had observed during one particularly contentious meeting where Claire had torn into a councilman suggesting they cut costs by reducing insulation standards. I'm getting angry. Well, same thing in this case. Just be careful. The firm has relationships to maintain. And I have residents who will freeze in winter if we skimp on insulation. Which relationship matters more? Richard had actually smiled. You've changed. A year ago, you would have found a diplomatic way to make that argument. A year ago, I was someone else. The Kensington building had won awards that spring. Best Sustainable Commercial Building, Innovation in Urban Design, recognition in 3 architecture journals. Clara had attended the ceremonies, accepted the accolades, and felt oddly disconnected from them. The work mattered, but the recognition felt hollow, like celebrating something that already belonged to the past. You're not even excited, James had said after one awards dinner. I'm proud of the work, but this isn't what drives me anymore. The East London project. Yeah, that matters. This is just buildings for people who already have everything. Character growth strikes again. They'd been together 5 months at that point, living separately still, but spending most nights at one place or the other, learning each other's rhythms, Clara's obsessive work habits, James's inability to put away laundry, the way they both got too intense about their projects and needed someone to pull them back before they burned out. It wasn't perfect. They'd fought about work boundaries, about whether Clara's perfectionism was dedication or self-destruction, about James's tendency to avoid conflict until it exploded. But they'd fought fair. No manipulation, no gaslighting, no using intimacy as a weapon or withholding affection as punishment, just 2 imperfect people trying to build something honest. Miranda had called in June with news about Adrian's appeal. Dismissed, she'd said without preamble. Judge called it frivolous and sanctioned his lawyer for wasting the court's time. Adrian owes you an additional £5,000 for your legal fees related to the appeal. Will he pay it? Eventually. We'll garnish wages if we have to, but Clara, this is over. He's out of options. You won one. Clara had ended the call and realized she felt nothing. No triumph, no vindication. Adrian had become irrelevant to her life. A footnote. Someone she used to know who'd made choices that destroyed him while she'd made choices that rebuilt her. She'd told James about the appeal dismissal that evening over dinner. How do you feel? He'd asked. Like I closed a book I finished reading months ago. It's done, that's all. No desire for revenge? Satisfaction at his suffering? I wanted him to face consequences. He did. But his life isn't my concern anymore. I have actual things to care about. James had raised his glass. To actual things that matter. They toasted and moved on to discussing the East London project's progress. The foundations were complete. Framing had started. The buildings were taking shape. 3 structures that would house 60 families and prove that affordable didn't have to mean cheaply made. The project had attracted attention. Other nonprofits. Local politicians suddenly interested now that it was succeeding. Reporters wanting to write stories about innovative affordable housing. Clara had done interviews, talked about sustainable design and community consultation, and why housing was a right, not a privilege. She'd learned to speak to cameras without feeling like an imposter, to own her expertise instead of downplaying it. "You're becoming famous," Melissa had teased one evening at the Admiral. A news segment about the project had run earlier that week. "I'm becoming exhausted. Fame is accidental." "Take the win. You've earned it." The buildings had reached completion in September, exactly 1 year after the Kensington opening. The official ceremony had been nothing like Kensington's champagne and canapes. Instead, a community barbecue. Residents moving into their new homes. Children running through spaces Clara had designed for exactly that purpose. Elderly residents marveling at the accessibility features. Clara had watched a woman in her 70s walk through her new flat, touching walls like she couldn't quite believe they were real. "It's beautiful," the woman had said, tears in her eyes. "I've lived in 4 different council flats and they were all falling apart. This is actually beautiful." That moment had mattered more than any award. Daniel had found Clara later, standing in one of the communal gardens watching residents explore their new space. "You did it," he'd said. "Said you would, and you did. We did it. This wasn't just me. But it doesn't happen without you, your design, your vision, your stubborn refusal to compromise on quality." He'd paused. "We're planning another project, bigger, South London. Interested?" Clara had looked at the buildings she'd created, at the people making them home, at the proof that architecture could serve everyone, not just those who could afford luxury. "Yeah," she'd said, "I'm interested." 1 year and 3 months after her divorce had been finalized, Clara had stood in a gallery in Shoreditch surrounded by her watercolor paintings. The exhibition had been Melissa's idea, pitched after seeing Clara's work and refusing to accept no for an answer. "You're good enough," Melissa had insisted. "Stop hiding it." The paintings were London, as Clara saw it. Not Big Ben or Tower Bridge or the tourist version, but quiet streets and corner pubs and the view from her bedroom at dawn. The Kensington rooftop garden, the East London buildings under construction, her life rebuilt in watercolor. The gallery was small, the crowd smaller, mostly friends and colleagues, but the paintings were there, visible, real. James had found her staring at her own work like she couldn't quite believe it existed. "Proud?" he'd asked, terrified someone will point out how amateur it all is. Or they'll see what I see, someone who creates things because they have to, because it's who they are. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise, I just pay attention." Richard Morrison had appeared, examining a painting of the Admiral's exterior with genuine interest. "I didn't know you painted," he'd said. "I didn't for a long time. Forgot I could." We do that. Forget the parts of ourselves that don't serve immediate ambitions. He'd looked at her. "The Bristol offer. It's still open if you want it." Clara had considered this. A year ago, she would have been paralyzed by the decision. Now it felt simple. "I'm good where I am. London feels like home again." "Fair enough. But Clara, don't let one city define you any more than one marriage did. You're capable of more than you realize." The second time he'd said that to her. Maybe this time she was ready to believe it. The evening had wound down. Friends departing, promises to meet for drinks soon. Clara had stood alone in the gallery at closing time, looking at evidence of the year she'd survived and rebuilt. Her phone had buzzed. Unknown number. For a moment she'd considered ignoring it, then curiosity had won. "I saw the article about your housing project. Congratulations. You're doing important work. Adrian." She'd stared at the message for a long moment, waiting for anger or pain or satisfaction, feeling nothing except faint pity for a man who couldn't move forward, who kept looking back at a life he'd destroyed. Clara had deleted the message without responding and turned off her phone. Outside, James had been waiting. Snow had started falling, early November flurries that probably wouldn't stick. "Ready?" he'd asked. "Yeah." They'd walked through Shoreditch together, past buildings and galleries and lives being lived. Clara's phone stayed off. The painting stayed in the gallery. Tomorrow she'd go back to the office and work on the South London project. She'd fight for sustainable materials and community spaces. She'd argue with budgets and politicians and anyone who suggested that affordable housing meant settling for less. But tonight, she'd walk through London with someone who saw her completely and didn't try to change what he saw. She'd survived. More than that, she'd rebuilt. Not into who she'd been before Adrian, but into someone new, someone stronger and more certain and less afraid of taking up space. The man who'd tried to destroy her had failed. He'd lost his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. And she'd gained everything that mattered: work she believed in, friends who showed up, love that felt honest instead of performed. Adrian had wanted a divorce. He'd gotten one. But he'd also given Clara something he'd never intended: freedom to become exactly who she was meant to be. And that was the best revenge of all.